Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Welcome to the Space Policy Show. We're so happy you could join us today. We have a great episode for you. Before we get started, just a reminder, you can find us at aerospace.org/policy or aerospace.org/the Space Policy Show. No spaces, dots, or underscores, all one word. Engage with us on Twitter, hashtag the Space Policy Show. Ask your questions in the video comment box. We are excited to answer all your questions, so please ask away. We have a great episode for you today. We've got Dr. Larry DeLucas here, and he will be being interviewed by Colleen Stover. So just last month, the first group of cadets graduated from the Air Force Academy to become the Space Force's first batch of officers to serve directly in the new military branch. Recently, the head of the U.S. Space Force, General Raymond, stated they've had a rush of applicants wanting to join the U.S. Space Force from other branches, which makes sense. And they're looking for people who have degrees in STEM fields, such as cybersecurity and intelligence. So what does this mean for today's students, and how can they get an interest in resources for pursuing a STEM career? Well, there's a lot of options available with the attractive commercial space sector and companies that are very high tech competing with the military. Motivations can be really difficult to balance, and it might be hard to attract that future talent. So today we've got Larry DeLucas, as I mentioned earlier, as he discusses STEM and his STEM education outreach. So Dr. DeLucas is quite an accomplished person. Not only is he an astronaut, but he has 5 degrees ranging from biochemistry to optometry, and he's in the National Optometry Hall of Fame. Dr. DeLucas also flew on the Space Shuttle Columbia in 1992 as a payload specialist and set a new record for the longest duration space flight shuttle at that time. He received the NASA Public Service Medal for microgravity projects, and he served as the chief scientist for the International Space Station for 2 years. Today, Larry is a principal scientist in the Human Exploration and Spaceflight Division at Aerospace Corporation. He has a rich history in sharing his skills and leadership with STEM activities to the youth here and abroad. We are extremely pleased to have him with us today. Interviewing Dr. DeLucas is Colleen Stover. She is a project manager for the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at Aerospace Corporation. Prior to joining Aerospace, she managed training and development for the prestigious British Council at various international posts. Colleen has a keen interest in STEM education, especially when it comes to inspiring the next generation of space explorers. Thank you both for coming today. We are so happy that you're here to discuss the next generation of space professionals and STEM in general. Before we turn it over to Colleen, again, I just want to remind you, engage with us, ask your questions. I'm sure Dr. DeLucas would love to answer any questions you might have about STEM or getting involved or becoming the next astronaut. Now over to you, Colleen, to get us started.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. So Larry, thanks for being with us today, the latest episode of the Space Policy Show. And wow, what a background you have. You're an optometrist, you're an astronaut, you've got 9 university degrees, 4 of which are honorary. You were the chief scientist for the International Space Station at one time. You've got 43 patents. You're a writer. You're an entrepreneur. So we're very lucky to have you here at the Aerospace Corporation. Love it.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Colleen.
So to start off with, for our listeners, can you help us understand what crystallographers do, and what does that have to do with your mission on the Space Shuttle in 1992?
Well, crystallographers, basically, I guess the easy way to describe it is we determine the structure of very complicated molecules. It started with small molecules like table salt, but today we can determine where every atom is in large proteins in our body, in bacteria, in viruses. And now why do we want to do that? Well, if you can see how a protein molecule is built, how it's constructed, where every atom is, it helps you better understand how it functions in our body or in bacteria or viruses like the coronavirus. And with that information, that gives us, a better insight into how our cells function and our whole body works. And so it's very important. But if you look at diseases, pretty much any disease you can think of is based on a protein in our body that stops working correctly. That's true of many cancers that we end up with. Or it can be a protein, that is involved in how a bacteria that invades your body replicates, or a virus.
What was the benefit of doing those experiments in microgravity on the shuttle?
We have two advantages growing crystals in space. One, they just naturally grow more slowly because it's a quiescent environment. There's almost no movement in there. And the only thing that makes a molecule get to the surface of the crystal to continue to grow the crystal is random diffusion. But also it selects out for single copies, because a single copy of a protein, as it vibrates in space, moves again, sometimes an order of magnitude faster than two copies stuck together. So you get rid of just naturally these aggregates that you don't want to form in the crystal.
Well, so you mentioned both math and science in your answer there. You were able to apply both. It's interesting how the things can overlap in different ways, but that gets us to the crux of our interview today. Give me an overview of how you view your STEM experience: science, technology, engineering, math, the education aspect of it, and just what are you hoping to achieve with the projects that you've chosen over the years?
Well, I started out as a professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and I loved teaching, both in college, and I did a lot of teaching at high schools and even elementary schools. And I noticed if I went into a high school and they filled the gymnasium with all the high school students, and I'm in the middle of the gym and I start talking about protein crystallography, there was a hum with students that were, that's right, talking and not always listening to me. But then after I flew in space, it was amazing, the difference. You go to that high school, and what I always do is I talk about what it's like to fly in space, but in addition, I sprinkle in the science, why I went to space, the kind of experiments we did, physics and math, and you can hear a pin drop. In fact, I can't remember ever, literally, I'm not kidding, probably 500 presentations that I've given in elementary schools, even as low as second and third graders, all the way up through high school. And there's absolutely no noise. They're so captivated by the space aspect. And then at the end, when I open it up to questions, you'd be amazed. I don't just get questions, more questions about flying in space. I get a lot of questions about the science that I had presented. And so I guess when I saw that, my idea as far as, continuing in STEM is to not only give presentations, because I learned, also as I did more and more outreach activities, is to engage those students in other ways. And so I ended up conducting many different STEM programs where the students actually participate in experiments. Many of them were just experiments on the ground, and I kind of gave them kits of growing protein crystals or even small molecule crystals. We did other experiments too, but that was the main one. But then
real science. Yeah.
That's right. But then if I had a space flight coming up, because the crystals that we grow in little tiny ampules or little tiny containers, we can actually fit, sometimes, and we did this, 2,000 experiments in something the size of a thermos. And so I gave the students proteins to try to optimize the crystal growth and pick the conditions, choose the conditions that they wanted to have us put in space. And so we did that. We go back to the schools and then put their experiment up on the shuttle and even the space station. And then when it came down, they got to look at crystals that they actually came up with the conditions for and grew, basically, and see the results and compare it with the Earth-grown crystals. And that kind of hands-on experience is critical, I think, for engaging students to want to, continue a career in science or any aspect of engineering even.
So you're really hoping to achieve, I guess, a level of excitement and also kind of real world based results.
That's right. It's so important to motivate students and let them feel the excitement of doing an experiment so that they'll want to continue. And I felt strongly about that just based on my own experience, and we can talk about that later.
Yeah. So, well, out of all you do have a long list of different STEM initiatives that you've been involved in, both participating and leading. What has been one of your greatest learning moments in STEM education in terms of something that you learned yourself?
Well, I would think, if I had to choose one experience, we had a flight that was coming up in about a year. And what we did is we chose 10 schools, some inner city schools, some schools way out in rural areas of Alabama, a private school, and 2 or 3 of the top public schools. So we had a mixture. We then challenged those students. I went to each school with a team of my associates, and I presented why we grow protein crystals, the whole aspect of structural biology, as we call it, and then told them that we were going to provide them with scholarships for college. But to get that scholarship, they had to win, and they were going to compete, the 10 schools. And what they had to do is design how they would grow their crystals. They had to present their results. I thought I turned that off. I'm sorry. They had to present their results in a poster competition, and we had 4 judges who weren't associated with the program. I actually chose professors actually from another university that we flew in, some drove in, and they evaluated the poster, and they asked the students the same questions. We had 10 questions, and we had to look at how the students responded to those questions. They did the scoring. I had nothing to do with it. They also were evaluated on their work ethic. How hard did they work on this program? And you could tell that from the data book that they had to keep. They all had to keep a data book of everything they did, all the experiments. We taught them about how you do that, dating the book properly and so forth. And so effort was about a third of the scoring. How well your data book was done was about a third, and then your oral presentation with the poster competition at the end of the year. So we had a banquet. I brought in 2 other astronauts to speak at that banquet. And at the end, the scoring, the presentations were done just prior to sitting down to eat. So I hadn't seen the results yet. And now I announced the 3rd place winner, the 2nd place winner, and the 1st place winner. So the 3rd place winner was an inner city school, not one of the top schools. The 2nd place winner was the private school, where my children actually went to school. I had to include them because I was on the board for that school. But they came in 2nd place, and I hadn't seen this. It was handed to me as I was standing up at the microphone, and then I opened a little piece of paper for the 1st place winner. It was a school, Tarrant High School, way out in the rural part of Alabama, where the students don't have the kind of facilities that they had in some of the best schools and the private schools they were competing against. Mm-hmm. And they won 1st prize. And when I announced it, the place erupted. The teachers were there, the parents were there, and those students came up to receive, they got a trophy and a plaque saying that they had done this. And then, of course, they all, share in a scholarship for all of them. There were 10 students from each school, so 10 students. And they were crying. The boys were crying. And so I'll never forget that. And ever since then, I've realized from that program and another leadership program that I've been associated with for almost a decade now, how important it is to engage the students. That leadership program, they do all kinds of things in the community. And at the end, they're competing for major scholarships. provide over $1 million of scholarships for those students.
Wow.
And so it's so important not just to give a lecture to the students, but let them experience the fun of doing research, doing science or engineering. We've had a few engineering projects have participated in also.
Yeah, certainly the spirit of competition can come out in different ways, and get teams excited, and especially a school that, as you said, doesn't normally have the kind of resources that others might have. So yeah. That's got it. That gave me goosebumps telling me that story. When they
Well, you know what? I was standing up there in my blue astronaut suit, and when they came up and those boys were crying, I had tears in my eyes. It meant that much to see how much it meant to them. So it's fun to do this, and that's why I want to continue doing it, for as long as I can.
It's got to be very rewarding.
It is.
Yeah. We are a space company, Aerospace Corporation, with the stand up of the U.S. Space Force. There's been a kind of a rising concern about if we're going to have the right people in the right place at the right time, the country's readiness for that. Indeed, I think yesterday the flag was released for the U.S. Space Force. There it is at the presentation for the White House, at the White House. And also, too, recently the U.S. Space Force has released a very inspiring recruitment video. I believe we have that tagged up as well. Why don't we take a moment and watch that video? This is
some people look to the stars and ask, what if? Our job is to have an answer. We have to imagine what will be imagined. Plan for what's possible while it's still impossible. Maybe you weren't put here just to ask the questions. Maybe you were put here to be the answer. Maybe your purpose on this planet isn't on this planet.
So Larry, with your experience, what do you think what's necessary for the success of the future development of the U.S. Space Force or space professionals in general? What kinds of things do you see?
Yeah, I base this on my NASA experience. Before I got involved with NASA, I was a biochemist and a crystallographer. My degrees were in chemistry and biochemistry, and of course, an eye doctor part-time. And I always worked with colleagues, but they had the same background. They were biochemists or chemists. That's what we did. Never, ever did I think I'd work with an engineer. And then all of a sudden, we realized, from a different scientist, actually a scientist at Marshall Space Flight Center, that, you can grow crystals of higher quality in space. And so I had to design a way to grow protein crystals because then no one was doing it at that time. And it can't be designed the way you would design it here on Earth. And I'm not an engineer. And so my first design, it was kind of trivial. I did do it on my own, but I went to an engineering firm to build it. And from the time I started drawing it on a piece of paper, it was about a month and a half later, we flew it on the space shuttle. You could never do it that quickly today, but back then we could. And so then we had to get more sophisticated. The component that I first designed, had no electrical components. We had to take photographs with just a handheld camera. Back then we used film. And so we got more sophisticated, but to do that and to have temperature control while you grow the crystals, I eventually started working with an engineering firm, and then I started hiring my own engineers. And what I realized is when you have engineers working right together with scientists, the sky's the limit. Literally, I hate to use that as a pun, but it is. It really is, because I could think of ideas as a scientist, but they never ended up in a new technique and a new biotechnology without those engineers. And so, I ended up at one point with 60 engineers that I had hired, and I had a large number of grants from both the National Institutes of Health and from NASA. And we started building sophisticated hardware for space. And along with that, new techniques on the ground. Many of my patents involved those, and it led to many spin-off companies to sell new equipment to help people grow better crystals on the ground. For the Space Force, I think the same thing is going to be critical. You're going to need people with a physics background, space experience, a number of different types of engineers, of course, aeronautical engineers, but electrical, chemical, there's just a whole gamut of the types of backgrounds. And to make the Space Force really do something special and put our nation ahead of China, ahead of Russia, they all need to work together. If I had the power, I'd have a huge building, maybe that takes up a city block, where you bring in the top people in all these areas, and they're working together on what the goals are for the Space Force. And what those need to be, probably, and this is my opinion, but one, we need to protect what we have in space right now, our satellites, our communication satellites, especially. I learned on my space mission, there's a lot of debris in low Earth orbit. And we learned from something the Chinese did, where they shot a rocket at a satellite that was only about 500 miles up. When it hit it, it created thousands of pieces of debris. Again, they're in a different inclination than the space station is, but the space station actually passes through it twice every 90 minutes. Every 45 minutes, it goes through it once. And so it can create real problems. You could do a similar thing in geosynchronous orbit, where all of our communication satellites are. So the Space Force needs to find ways to protect our satellites. Maybe even if we can't do that, how can we get new satellites up there very quickly to replace ones that maybe get damaged if someone were purposely trying to hurt our communication? Because that is critical for all the sophisticated weaponry we have today to defend our country.
So, yeah. So to that end, then, I know that Aerospace Corporation, we've the Center for Space Policy and Strategy has put out a number of papers on space debris. And space traffic management in general. So I know that is a concern. To that end, I'm wondering if you kind of talked about the importance of the, I guess, interdisciplinary aspect of STEM. So you had your idea about getting all of these top-notch people together in a city block and kind of working on the top problems, and be it experts from the math background or an engineering background, a science background. I'm wondering, how do we get those people working together and kind of cross-pollinating ideas on looking at problems in new ways, I guess, thinking outside of the box?
I think you form teams, and the teams have a diverse set of backgrounds, and each team, maybe one goal is something I didn't even mention at this point, but what about an asteroid coming toward Earth? How are we going to stop it from really creating a lot of problems, if not destroying life altogether? And so you could have a team working on that and coming up with novel ways that we can address that. Again, a team to figure out a novel way to quickly replace satellites that get damaged. So I've always found that when I work in a team, I always try to surround myself, and this isn't hard, with people a lot smarter than I am. And so by doing that, we express what the goal is, and then we let people just freelance. What's your idea? How would we do this? And we argue with each other in a nice way, but we come up with, in the end, the best solution. That's the way we developed our flight hardware to support protein crystal growth. And that hardware is still being used today. In fact, I have a mission coming up this fall, and we're going to involve students in that mission once again.
So yeah, maybe in order to kind of get to that, professionals solving problems, maybe to get to that, then you need to start those that kind of team building or interdisciplinary approach to problems at the college level. the high school level, even at the elementary level, what people's strengths are, make sure to put them in a place where they can shine, but make sure that they also have access to people that think differently than them.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. The leadership program that I talked about, what we do in that case is, so this is leadership, not STEM, but what we do is we bring schools together that are within about a 20-mile radius. And so, again, it's 6 students in this case from each school get selected based on hard work ethic and a desire to make something of themselves. So that's how they're selected by their teachers. But then we have the students from the private school working with the students from the inner city school as a team. So teamwork, we teach them that right in high school, and we can do the same thing with STEM. One way to do it with STEM is have science clubs. I was president of my science club in high school, and we had some people that were doing it that didn't know they want to be a scientist. I'm one of those. so I knew I liked science, but I thought, I could never do this. And I didn't realize that if you just work hard and you have a real passion for what you're doing, you can do it. And so I was surprised that many high schools do not have science clubs today, like we used to. Back when I went to high school, which is a long time ago, I thought pretty much every high school had a science club, but that's not true today. But it's a good way to start getting students to work as a team to develop a project. The project we had when I was president of the science club, I wanted a telescope, and so there were about 12 of us in that club. We all took turns grinding a 12-inch mirror. It took us 1 year to grind that mirror into a parabola, and then we sent it off to get it silvered and polished. But we built a 12-inch reflecting telescope. That was our project.
Oh, I wonder if we'd have trouble getting young people committed to a 1 year. To a 1 year glass grinding project.
Well, good news was it wasn't full time. Each day someone would grind on it for about an hour. But it took a long time. In retrospect, I should have chosen maybe a 5-inch mirror. We would have been done a lot faster.
Right. So we've touched on this a little bit with the STEM education and what you've in some of your comments and stuff. STEM does traditionally have problems getting to certain communities in our country. Certainly, girls and women, there's a push to get them more involved. Youth that are in rural areas and low income areas, and also people of color. What do you think might be some ideas, or do you have ideas for, based on your experience or things that you want to work on in the future, for getting more of those communities involved in our future of space professionals?
Well, I think more and more women are going into science and engineering. I know we had several female engineers that worked for me, and they were some of the brightest. So I don't think there's such a problem there. But in communities where they haven't had the background education through elementary school and then in high school, when they enter college, they feel really challenged, and they are really challenged to compete. That's right, if they do. I know I taught at a community college where some of the students just didn't have the background. And I think the key in cases like that is to let them work side by side in a lab, maybe for a summer. So we did have I had a STEM program that I was part of that was funded by NASA, and we had students work side by side as summer interns with professors. That's what really made me realize that I could do science. When I started in college, to be honest with you, I was on the baseball and basketball team in high school, and I thought I'm going to be a coach. And my first chemistry class, I did real well on the first couple exams, and the teacher just walked up to me and said, would I like to come work for him? And as I started working for that that professor who I thought was the smartest person in the world, I made mistakes, and he was nice enough to tell me why things didn't work the way they should have and what I should have done differently. But by the end of that summer, I was suggesting to him new ways we could design an experiment. And he usually said, go try it. And when it worked, I started to think, wow, I can do this. If you really love what you're doing, you can do it. And I just started to gain confidence. That's what we have to do to students that haven't had that background education. We have to get them engaged with hands-on, working closely, with professors if they're starting college in a college. If you can get them before that, it's important too. And that's why a lot of the educational programs, STEM programs in high schools and even elementary schools are so important.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So what are you working on now? We'd like to know.
Well, when I flew in space, I didn't get sick. About 75 to 80% of male astronauts usually, barf is the better way to say it. The first few days you're up there, it's a little better percentage, I think, for females. But I didn't get sick, but I couldn't think. Trying to reason was very difficult the first 3 or 4 days. Then it was about the fourth day, I thought, wow, now I can think again. I'm sharp. But in retrospect, looking back, I think maybe I was 80%. So your cognitive ability is certainly affected, and it's probably due to the shift of fluid. We know there's an increase in even your cerebral spinal fluid, and now we're starting to see some permanent damage it can cause to your brain and your eyes. And so I've always had an interest in how we could address that. Also, when you go to space, the way instruments are designed, you need to be real careful. I worked in a glove box, usually about 6 to 7 hours each day, and it was pulling my arms out, and I needed to have my hands work close together, but the glove box, the cuffs were tight on my arm. I was pulling my arms this way. So I was always working against that tension. Well, guess what? In about the 8th day, I was having difficulty just moving my right arm. And we had a physician on board my flight, Ellen Baker, and she saw me I was holding my shoulder in pain. And she said, Larry, take off your shirt and put your arms up against the wall. And when I did, my scapula was popping out of my back by about 1.5 inches. So why did all that happen? Well, the tension of those cuffs pulling out and me fighting that tension caused me to pinch my thoracic nerve. So human factors, the way we design instruments so we can work comfortably in space, is critical. And so recently I partnered on a proposal with a bunch of really bright scientists at the University of North Dakota. They actually have a whole habitat there that can mimic what we're going to do when we build a habitat on the surface of Mars, for example, or on the moon. But anyway, I partnered with them and we put in a proposal to NASA. We won't know for some time whether we're selected, but that's one of the areas I'd like to work in, because I think I have, a lot of experience about how you deal with both areas. The cognitive part, because of my STEM work, you may not realize this. There have been some studies in many places. It started, I think, in Europe and Japan, where students, they have a control group where students read in a book things that they have to learn. Could be history, science, doesn't matter. But other students are doing that same reading, but when they look at their computer and read, say, how a cell works, a human cell, they're seeing it in 3 dimensions. And they can take a stylus and touch the membrane of the cell, and what pops out is a more detailed image of the membrane and how it's composed of proteins. And those proteins, there may be a little image that pops up when you touch with your stylus that tells you what that protein does. Well, when you look at images like that in 3D, it hits a different part of your brain. And what these studies have shown now conclusively with thousands of students and control students where they don't have access to the 3D is that you learn more, and 6 months later, when you're retested, you remember more. And I think this could be a very useful way to help astronauts on a long trip to Mars, where I know, being able to reason is going to be effective due to the shift of pressure on your brain, just for one thing. And so we put in that proposal that we're going to test both ways, training, say, how do you perform a malfunction procedure? And we're going to have actually students at the University of North Dakota, some only learn in 2D compared to 3D, and then we're going to compare those results. And it'll be a large enough number so statistically, we can demonstrate whether or not it'll be valuable or not.
Wow, that's great. That's fascinating. And again, you're doing that cross-discipline kind of thing where you're taking education and applying it to space.
That's right.
That's great. Yeah. That's great. So we're getting ready to wrap up. I wanted to ask you one last question just for inspiring us. Do you have a life motto that you live by, or is there anything that you find yourself repeating?
I'd say I try to mimic the way I deal with people and the way I go about, my job based on my father. My father was the director of the whole payment center for Social Security for the whole Southeast. He had about 2,500 employees. And the day he retired, the last day, they formed a line and all 2,500 employees wanted to say goodbye. And it lasted the whole day until about 7 o'clock that night. And I asked my dad, why do these people like you so much? And his answer was, I treat everybody equally. The janitor, the top executive, it didn't matter. And I always told them the truth. If someone didn't get a raise, I told them exactly why they didn't get the raise, so the next time they could address that problem. And so that's the way I've, approached life. And I've realized in my area, and I think it's true of all areas, if you pursue what you really enjoy doing and work hard at it, you'll do well at it. And so I don't know if you want to call that a model, but that's the way I approach life.
No, that's great. That's great. And be nice to people while you're at it, right? Don't burn the bridges. That's great.
That's right.
Well, thank you, Larry, again for being with us, Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy.
Very good question.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. And certainly if anybody has any comments or they'd like to follow up with something, there's a comment box below today's video, as well as you can tweet the Space Policy Show. So thank you, Larry.
All right. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeLucas, for being on our show today. We are honored to have you, and we are so appreciative of your passion and your outreach that you've done for STEM and all the future space explorers out there. And thank you to Colleen for taking the time to join us and interview Dr. DeLucas. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your efforts that you've done for STEM for the Aerospace Corporation. And you don't know, you could be the next space explorer out there. So keep watching the stars because you don't know what will happen.